All right, friends, we are now going to focus on some basics about cells before we get into the details about cells. The first thing we need to understand is that there are two basic most fundamental cell types on planet Earth. And everybody, when we first start talking, wants to go plant and animal, okay? And it's not that. That we can get even more basic, more fundamental than that, to more broad than that. There are two major types of cells, and they are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, well, let's go to it. Prokaryotic cells, first of all, when you hear the term prokaryotic, you need to think bacteria. So I'm going to say prokaryotic, and you're going to say bacteria. Got it? Okay? These are the most simple cells that exist. They lack a nucleus. In fact, they have no little compartments whatsoever. They're basically a cell membrane and some cytoplasm and some genes, and that's it. That's an oversimplification, but there's no little compartments, no little organelles, if you will. Okay? It is the most ancient cell type. Prokaryotes, as far as we can tell from the fossil record, and yes, there are fossil bacteria. And you're like, Coleman, how can they find a fossil bacteria? Good question, but they can. They find them in the rocks. They make very, very thin slices of the rocks, and they can find these fossilized bacteria. And so far, that is the most ancient life form we've been able to find. And prokaryotes arose evolutionarily on Earth way before eukaryotes did, which are the more complex type of cells that are on Earth. So these are the most primitive cells, meaning they are simple, they were here first, they're ancient, they're very, very ancient. Okay, cell types. Now, all of that said, it sounds like they don't have very much going for them, but are they successful? You bet they are. Just because they are primitive doesn't mean they're not successful. Just because they're simple doesn't mean they're not successful. Bacteria are enormously successful. They're arguably the most successful organisms on the planet. They're everywhere in huge numbers. So very, very successful group. Just not terribly fancy as compared to these. This is a eukaryotic cell. Now, these are the types of cells that you have, and that everything on Earth has, if it is not a bacterium, okay? So everything except bacteria, every living thing except bacteria is made up of eukaryotic cells, okay? Protists, which you may not know what that means yet, but they're things like paramecium and amoeba and stuff like that. Fungi, plants, and animals are all made up of eukaryotic cells. What does that mean? Well, that means they are made up of cells that are complex, that have little cell parts, specifically a nucleus, but other cell parts as well, little compartments where different things can happen in the cell, different activities can happen in protected environments in the cell because they're packaged away in little structures called organelles. There are these little organelles, of which the nucleus is one, which are basically little packets that are made out of membrane, much like the cell membrane itself, but they're little bubbles inside the cell that package certain activities. This is the more recent type of cell to evolve. These evolved after prokaryotes did. In fact, a good deal after prokaryotes did. Probably I think it's about 2.5 billion years ago, whereas prokaryotes are about 1 billion years older than that. These are much more complex than prokaryotes. They have more sophisticated cell parts and more sophisticated functions. They can do more than prokaryotes can and do it better, at least in some aspects, than prokaryotes can. But again, prokaryotes are still also very, very successful. They're just not as highly specialized, generally speaking. All right, now there are two major types of eukaryotic cells. We are now going to focus, on eukaryotic cells exclusively, at least until we talk about bacteria in more detail later on in the year. Two major types of eukaryotic complex advanced cells. They are plant and animal. Okay, so this is where we get to say plant and animal. All right. Now, plant cells have certain fundamental characteristics. First of all plant cells have a cell wall, and you can see that here. It's a protective encasing of the cell, if you will, in cellulose. If you remember, we've talked about cellulose. It's that undigestible polysaccharide that plants can make. Also unique to plant cells is they have an organelle in the center that's like a great big balloon. It's called a vacuole, a large central vacuole. Usually this vacuole contains lots of water, but you don't see this thing in animal cells. Animal cells do have vacuoles, but they're not huge like this, and they don't stick around. This is a kind of a permanent structure, where in animal cells vacuoles come and go. And probably the most important organelle arguably that exists is a chloroplast, because that is what allows photosynthesis to occur, as you already know. Only plants and some photosynthetic algae have chloroplasts. Really important organelle. Okay? Now, animal cells are different, and basically that they don't have those three things. Okay, no cell wall, so you've got an exposed membrane here. Remember, plants, let me just back up 1 second. Plants do have cell membranes. This is the membrane right here, but you can see it's tucked inside that cell wall, which is right immediately outside of it. Animal cells have no cell wall, and of course no chloroplast, and no large central vacuole. They do have little vacuoles that are kind of transient. They'll come and go, they appear, they disappear, they get made, they go away, but no large central one that is permanent. Now, cells are little, generally speaking. There are a few exceptions to this, but generally speaking, you're made up of trillions of tiny little cells. Why do they have to be so small? Why couldn't you just be one great big, here you are. Why couldn't you just be one big cell? Okay, one big blob. Well, most of the reason is because cells take in all their nutrients, oxygen, whatever they need. They take it in to themselves from their environment that is all around them. Okay? And if you have a cell that gets really big, like this one, when you make a cell, like here's a little cell, when you make a circle bigger, or a sphere, I should say, a sphere like a ball, bigger. You have a small ball and a big ball, okay? When you make that ball bigger, you increase the surface area of that ball, the surface that you can touch and hold. But when you make that ball bigger, the volume expands at a greater rate than the surface area. It's just a geometry thing, okay? It just does. When you make a sphere that maybe started out being this big and you make it this big, the volume is increasing its size at a greater rate than the surface that covers that volume. So what this means is that if you make this little cell big, you're essentially giving him a whole bunch of guts in here that he's got to nourish with oxygen and food and that. But you're not making his mouth very much bigger. What's his mouth? Well, basically his entire cell membrane, because he takes nutrition in through this cell membrane surface. So you've made the guts that need feeding a lot bigger, but you haven't made the cell surface all that much bigger. You made it bigger, but not as big as you've made the volume, because of a geometry thing. That's just how spheres are as they get larger. The volume increases in a greater amount than the surface area does. So why do cells have to be small? so that they can provide lots of nourishment to a smaller amount of volume. Their surface area is larger compared to the amount of volume they have to feed. Okay, so large surface area and a small volume allows for adequate amounts of materials to move in and out of the cell and nourish that relatively small inside. If the volume gets too big, the cell surface size doesn't get big enough to feed, if you will, to service that whole inner part of that cell. So what you see here is basically, if you look at this, here's a cube that is 5 units high, 5 units this way, 5 units this way, 5 units that way. Here is the same basic size cube here, but we've split it up like this. And you can imagine that there's lots more surfaces here than there is here. There's lots more surface area from all these little cubes than there is from this one big cube. And that way, if these were cells, they could get nutrition from all these into their little cellular bodies, because they'd have more surface exposed to the environment. All right, another thing to be aware of with cells is we often see in cell structures things that are folded, okay? And the question is why? Why is this folding? Well, it's like anything. If you want to fit a big thing into a small space, you fold it. And we've already established that we have to have lots of surface area because the surfaces of cells are where the action is. That's where we take in nutrients. It's where enzymes might be stuck on the surfaces of cells and they're busy doing things, and we want a lot of stuff to happen, and so we pack. So to pack the most stuff into a small space, we often fold membranes up like this, okay? So increasing surface area, when in doubt, just say increasing surface area, Coleman. That's pretty much what you need to know. All right, make sure you know the term organelles, little cell parts or compartments. They are basically membranes that are hollow, that are like a little balloon, if you will, and there's some activity that occurs in the little compartment that might be different from what's occurring out here in the cytoplasm. If this is my cells, 2 different things can go on. Something could go on in here that's real different from something that's going on out here. So it allows chemical processes that may be incompatible with each other. For example, if you're a plant, you're making food in a chloroplast. Maybe that's a chloroplast, and you're making food in here. But you also need to eat food. So you've got another compartment, a mitochondrion. And we take the food that was made here and we can digest that food here. We wouldn't want those 2 processes occurring in the same compartment. They're completely incompatible. Making food and digesting food, you'd have a constant fight on your hands. But here we can make food in one thing and consume the food in another thing, and those processes are separated from each other. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. We will get into much more detail in class on plant and animal cells. I will catch you at the next podcast. Take care.